December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii erupted in fire and fury. Japanese aircraft roared across the sky, dropping bombs on Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned. Oil fires raged across the water. Nearly 2,500 Americans were killed in a single morning that would, in President Roosevelt's words, live in infamy. Across the United States, anger boiled. Families who listened to the radio that day clenched their fists, their lives forever altered by the news. Japanese pilots were painted in the press as merciless enemies. Ordinary Americans, many of whom had never even met a Japanese person, suddenly felt an intense, personal hatred for an entire nation. For soldiers shipped off to the Pacific, there was no question. This was a war of survival. They carried into battle not just rifles and rations, but a deep thirst for revenge. When Japanese soldiers were captured, rare as it was, because so many fought to the death, those prisoners braced themselves for the worst. In their minds, they knew what awaited them. Torture, starvation, execution. This expectation was not paranoia. It was ingrained into Japanese soldiers from their first day in uniform. They were taught that surrender was shameful, that enemies were brutal, that the Americans would treat them like animals. To be taken prisoner was, in their eyes, to be condemned. And so, when the first Japanese POWs were shipped across the ocean and brought to camps in the American heartland, they carried fear heavier than their chains. Their eyes darted nervously at every guard tower, every barbed wire fence. They waited for cruelty. They waited for vengeance. They waited for punishment for Pearl Harbor. But what they found was something entirely different. In the rolling fields of Texas, the vast plains of the Midwest, and the orchards of California, American farmers faced a crisis of their own. With so many young men overseas, crops risked withering in the fields. Harvests needed hands. Families who had watched their sons march off to war needed labor to survive. And so, astonishingly, those Japanese prisoners of war, men who had once fought under the rising sun, who had cheered the attack on Pearl Harbor, were now handed tools, shovels, and baskets. They worked in the soil of the very country they had attacked, side by side with American families. And then came the moment that stunned them most of all: kindness. Farmers gave them meals, real meals, with bread, meat, and fruit. Guards allowed them to rest under the shade on blistering summer days. Children, curious and unafraid, brought them gifts at Christmas or left drawings at the fences. Some POWs were even invited into family kitchens for dinner, sitting across from mothers whose own sons were fighting Japanese troops on distant islands. For men who had expected cruelty, this treatment was unimaginable. It contradicted everything they had been taught. Many wrote in their diaries of their disbelief. How can the enemy feed us? How can they treat us with dignity? It was, in its own quiet way, as shocking as Pearl Harbor. Except this time, the shock came not from bombs and blood, but from mercy. This is the story of how enemies became human in the unlikeliest of places. A story of how rage turned into compassion, how fear gave way to respect, and how, in the middle of the bloodiest war in human history, Japanese prisoners of war came to see American farmers not as demons, but as men and women capable of surprising kindness. The question is, why? Why, in a time of hatred, when so many Americans wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor, did farmers show kindness to the very men who wore the uniform of the enemy? And what did that kindness mean for the prisoners? Men who would return home forever changed by their time on American soil. The attack on Pearl Harbor had transformed the United States overnight. A nation that had remained hesitant about entering the war was now fully committed. Factories shifted into overdrive. Young men lined up at recruiting stations. Families hung gold stars in their windows, mourning sons who would never come home. But anger was not confined to the battlefield. Across America, suspicion of anything Japanese ran deep. Japanese Americans on the West Coast were forced into internment camps under Executive Order 9066. Propaganda films painted Japanese soldiers as fanatical, inhuman, even animalistic. In the public imagination, Japan had become an enemy unlike any other, a nation that had struck without warning, and one that seemed to embrace death rather than defeat. On the battlefields of the Pacific, this perception was reinforced daily. Japanese troops fought with extraordinary ferocity. At Bataan, Corregidor, Guadalcanal, and later Saipan and Iwo Jima, American soldiers faced an enemy who refused to surrender. The Japanese Code of Bushido declared capture dishonorable. Soldiers were taught that it was better to die for the emperor than to live in disgrace. This cultural difference created a grim reality. Few Japanese soldiers ever became prisoners of war. Most died in combat, charging in suicidal banzai attacks or taking their own lives rather than raising their hands. Those who were captured often did so only when unconscious or too wounded to resist. And when they were taken prisoner, they expected horrors. Japanese propaganda had long warned them that Americans were monsters. Leaflets and indoctrination sessions insisted that American soldiers tortured prisoners, mutilated them, or executed them outright. To fall into enemy hands, they were told, was a fate worse than death. Imagine, then, the mindset of a Japanese POW captured in 1942 or 1943. He had been told his captors would starve him, beat him, and humiliate him. He had been told that surrender itself erased his honor forever. On the journey across the Pacific to an American camp, fear was his constant companion. But what awaited them on American soil was not brutality, but bureaucracy. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment of prisoners of war. In Europe, where millions of German and Italian POWs were already being captured, America had resolved to follow the rules. Prisoners would be fed, housed, and treated for wounds. They would not be executed in revenge. They would not be starved. Instead, many would be put to work. America faced a labor crisis at home. With millions of young men overseas, fields went untilled. Crops risked spoiling. Factories needed hands. The government saw an opportunity. POWs could be used as a labor force. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could work in non-military roles. They would receive small wages, basic comforts, and the ability to pass their time productively. For farmers, this arrangement was both strange and practical. Imagine a Texas cotton farmer in 1943. His son might be fighting in the Pacific, perhaps even killed at Pearl Harbor. Yet standing in his fields now were Japanese prisoners, dressed in khaki, harvesting crops under the watch of armed guards. For many Americans, it was an uncomfortable sight. And yet, without that labor, their livelihoods would collapse. For the POWs, the shock was even greater. They expected death. Instead, they were handed shovels. They expected starvation. Instead, they sat down to meals with bread, potatoes, and sometimes even meat, better rations than many Japanese soldiers ever received in their own army. They expected hatred. Instead, they encountered a strange mix of distance, suspicion, and, at times, simple kindness. Of course, not all interactions were friendly. Many farmers distrusted the prisoners. Some guards harbored intense resentment. Stories circulated of harsh treatment and hostility. But in countless instances, something unexpected happened. Americans looked past the uniform and saw men, not monsters. And Japanese POWs, conditioned to expect cruelty, found themselves stunned by humanity. The stage was set for one of the most paradoxical chapters of the Second World War. While battles raged in the Pacific, while flames consumed cities and soldiers slaughtered each other on islands thousands of miles away, in the quiet heartland of America, enemies lived side by side. They worked the same soil. They shared food. They exchanged hesitant words that slowly built into fragile bonds. The central question remained: how could such kindness exist in the shadow of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and the Pacific's bloody struggle? The answer lay in what came next, when Japanese prisoners arrived in America's towns and farms, and their first encounters with ordinary Americans overturned everything they thought they knew about their enemy. The first Japanese prisoners of war arrived on American soil in 1942, shipped across the Pacific under heavy guard. Many were captured in the Philippines after the brutal fighting at Bataan and Corregidor. Others were taken wounded at Guadalcanal or pulled from the wreckage of downed aircraft. They traveled in silence, their heads bowed, convinced they were being transported to their deaths. When the ships docked on the West Coast and trains carried them inland, the men braced for humiliation. Instead, something remarkable happened. They were processed, assigned prisoner numbers, and then given food, real food. White bread, potatoes, even fruit. One POW later wrote in his diary that he thought it must be a trick. We expected beatings, starvation. Instead, we were fed. It was strange, unbelievable. The United States had already established large prisoner-of-war camps for Germans and Italians captured in North Africa. Soon, Japanese prisoners joined them. Camps appeared across the South, Midwest, and even the Great Plains, Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska. Many were built in isolated areas, far from large cities, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But these were not death camps. The barracks were wooden and drafty, but they offered warmth. Prisoners were given blankets, clothing, and regular meals. They were expected to work on farms, in canneries, sometimes in logging camps, but they were not beaten into submission. For the Americans, treating prisoners humanely reinforced a sense of identity. This was a democracy at war, a nation fighting not just with bombs and bullets, but with ideals. Feeding, clothing, and respecting enemies was more than compliance with the Geneva Convention. It was a way of proving that America fought differently, that it would not descend into the same darkness it condemned. For the prisoners, these experiences planted seeds that would grow long after they returned home. Some wrote of their gratitude. Others admitted that their hatred had dissolved in the face of kindness. Years later, when Japan and the United States became allies, memories of humane treatment in POW camps helped smooth reconciliation. Individual stories illuminate the larger truth. A soldier who carved a toy for a farmer's child never forgot the smile he received in return. A prisoner who shared stew with an American family remembered the warmth long after the war ended. A farmer who once cursed Japan came to see the men in his fields not as enemies, but as human beings caught in a war they did not start. These moments mattered. They bridged cultures. They softened the sting of propaganda. And they revealed a truth that war so often tries to bury, that even in times of hatred, humanity can survive. When the war ended in 1945, the prisoners were sent home. Some wept as they left, torn between relief and regret. For them, America had become a place of contradictions, the enemy nation, but also the land where they discovered unexpected compassion. Today, few remember this chapter of history. Memorials focus on great battles, on victories and defeats, on destruction and triumph. But perhaps the story of POWs on American farms offers something just as valuable, a lesson in humanity. Because if kindness could be found in 1944, at the very height of a war born from hatred, then kindness can be found anywhere, in any time of conflict. The Japanese POWs came to America expecting cruelty. They left with memories of farmers who shook their hands, children who gave them gifts, and families who treated them as men. And in that transformation lies the true legacy of this story. For in the end, Pearl Harbor began a war of fire. But in America's fields, it ended, for a few men at least, in an unexpected harvest of compassion. And that, perhaps, is the greatest paradox of all. By 1944, Japanese POWs had become a familiar sight across parts of rural America. They worked in cotton fields, sugar beet rows, and orchards, their tin uniforms and guarded convoys now woven into the rhythms of American life. What had begun as shock, on both sides, slowly settled into a strange form of coexistence. For Americans, treating prisoners humanely became a point of pride. They knew the stories of the Bataan Death March, of Allied POWs starved and beaten in Japanese camps. They saw newspaper articles describing the horrors in the Pacific. And many asked themselves, should we treat our enemies as cruelly as they treated us? The U.S. government's answer was no. By adhering to the Geneva Convention, by showing restraint and even kindness, America sought to prove not just military superiority, but moral superiority. This war, they believed, was not only about conquering territories, but about defending a way of life, one where even enemies were shown dignity. For Japanese prisoners, this approach sowed confusion, doubt, and sometimes admiration. They had been told Americans were brutes. Instead, they found structure, discipline, and, even more shocking, compassion. One former POW later recalled, "When I was captured, I thought my life was over. But in America, I worked, I ate, and I learned. It was there I realized the Americans were not monsters. They were human beings." In fact, some camps offered classes in English, math, and even vocational skills. American chaplains conducted Bible studies and church services that prisoners were free to attend. Many participated, not out of conversion, but out of curiosity. The chance to learn, to read, and to occupy the mind was itself a gift. The irony was staggering. On Pacific Islands, men fought and killed each other with ferocity. Back in the United States, those same enemies sometimes sat across from one another in relative peace. Farmers began to see the benefits of this arrangement beyond labor. Japanese POWs brought skills from home, knowledge of rice cultivation, carpentry, and fishing. In some towns, prisoners crafted intricate wood carvings, furniture, or even toys for local children. A Nebraska family later discovered that a small wooden chest in their attic had been made by a Japanese prisoner during the war. Prisoners also saw unexpected glimpses of American daily life. They watched families gather around dinner tables, saw children playing in fields, heard laughter from porches on summer evenings. For men raised in a rigid, militaristic culture, this was astonishing. They had been told Americans were weak and decadent, incapable of true discipline. Yet here they saw hard-working families, united in sacrifice, sending their sons to war and laboring at home. For some, these experiences reshaped their worldview. In memoirs written years later, former POWs described the shock of discovering America's abundance. They noted the sheer amount of food available, even in wartime rationing, compared to scarcity back home. They admired the friendliness of American children, and they were stunned that farmers who had lost loved ones in the Pacific could still offer them decency. Not every story was one of kindness, of course. Some prisoners endured insults, cold treatment, or suspicion. Guards sometimes lashed out, and not all Americans were willing to forgive or forget. But the balance of stories leaned toward surprise, toward the realization that, in the heart of America, humanity had not been abandoned. This had consequences far beyond the individual farms. When the war finally ended in 1945, Japanese POWs were gradually repatriated. They returned to a homeland in ruins, cities flattened by bombing, food scarce, the emperor himself announcing surrender in a voice heavy with defeat. They carried with them memories of an enemy unlike the one they had been told to hate. Some spoke to their families of America's wealth, its fairness, and its strange kindness. Others struggled with shame, torn between loyalty to their homeland and the undeniable truth of their experiences. But many admitted that their time in America had planted seeds of respect, even admiration. A number of former POWs would go on to visit the United States after the war, some even emigrating permanently. In rare but poignant cases, bonds forged during captivity endured across decades. Letters were exchanged. Families reconnected. Children of farmers grew up to meet former prisoners who had once worked their land, sharing stories that spanned oceans. For Americans, too, these memories lingered. Some farmers admitted that employing Japanese POWs had changed them, forcing them to see their enemies as individuals rather than faceless soldiers. For children who had grown up watching prisoners in their towns, the war became less about propaganda and more about lived reality. The realization that even sworn enemies could laugh, smile, and work the earth in familiar ways. Historians now look back on this chapter as one of the war's great paradoxes. At the very moment when the Pacific War reached its most savage heights, when battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa cost hundreds of thousands of lives, on the home front, Japanese prisoners were eating meals, singing songs, and sometimes even sharing holidays with Americans. The contrast could not have been sharper. But perhaps the greatest consequence was what it meant for the future. The kindness shown to Japanese POWs, however limited, played a role in softening the image of America for those who had lived through it. In post-war Japan, as the nation rebuilt under Allied occupation, many former prisoners quietly carried the memory that Americans were capable of generosity. And for the United States, the story reinforced a national self-image, that America, even in the depths of war, had acted with honor, that its power lay not only in its armies and bombs, but in its willingness to treat even enemies with humanity. One American farmer summed it up years later. "We could have treated them the way they treated our boys, but then we'd be no different. Feeding them, working them, letting them live, that was the American way." The war would end. Japan would rise again as an ally of the United States. But in the quiet, hidden corners of history, The story of Japanese POWs on American farms remains one of the most striking reminders of how humanity can endure, even when nations are locked in brutal conflict. The stage was set for the most emotional moments of all, those times when prisoners who had expected cruelty instead wept at kindness, realizing that the enemy they had been taught to hate could show them dignity. The true climax of this story did not come with gunfire or battles, but with moments so small they almost went unnoticed. Moments where kindness shattered years of hatred and fear. For the Japanese prisoners, the weight of expectation never truly left them. They remembered the voices of instructors back home. The Americans will torture you. They will starve you. Better to die than be captured. Each day in America tested those words against reality. And every day, reality proved them wrong. The most powerful turning points came not in the camps, but in the fields, kitchens, and homes of ordinary Americans. One winter in Texas, after a long day of picking cotton, a farmer's wife brought steaming bowls of stew to the prisoners. The men sat on the back steps, unsure if they were meant to eat it. When she gestured for them to begin, they stared in disbelief. One soldier later admitted he fought back tears as he lifted the spoon. In his diary, he wrote, "My enemy gave me warmth when I thought only of cold. In that moment, I saw them not as demons, but as people." In Arkansas, on Christmas Eve 1944, local children walked up to the barbed wire fence of a POW camp. They had wrapped small gifts, cookies, mittens, even hand-drawn cards, and passed them through to the prisoners. The Japanese men bowed deeply, overwhelmed. Some wept openly, unable to reconcile these gestures with the hatred they had expected. Another account tells of a Nebraska farmer who, after a season of work, invited the prisoners to a small farewell meal. Bread, ham, and coffee were set on the table. Guards allowed it, standing watch at a distance. The POWs sat stiffly at first, but when the farmer raised his glass and said, "To peace, someday," they relaxed. For men who had once shouted "Banzai" on Pacific battlefields, the idea of sharing a toast with Americans was unthinkable, and yet it happened. These were not isolated events. Across the heartland, similar moments unfolded quietly. A guard who looked the other way as a prisoner rested in the shade. A farmer's wife who slipped extra fruit into the baskets. A child who asked a POW to carve a toy, and proudly kept it for years. For many prisoners, the realization was overwhelming. They had braced for cruelty, yet here was compassion. They had expected fists, yet here were open hands. Some admitted that this kindness shook them more than combat ever had. One former POW later confessed, "On the battlefield, I hated them. In the camp, I feared them. But when they treated me like a man, I could no longer hate. I could no longer believe the lies." The emotional turning point was not just personal, it carried symbolic weight. These gestures of kindness, repeated across farms and towns, broke down the barrier between propaganda and reality. They showed that war was fought by nations, but humanity remained in the hands of individuals. For American farmers, too, these moments carried power. Many admitted that seeing their enemies humbled, working the land, and showing gratitude softened their own rage. A Texas farmer whose son had died in the Pacific once said, "I wanted to hate them forever. But when I saw them eat at my table and bow in thanks, I realized hate couldn't bring my boy back. Maybe kindness could bring something else." By 1945, as the war turned in America's favor, the bonds formed in these quiet corners of history stood in stark contrast to the carnage of Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and Hiroshima. On the battlefield, men tore each other apart. On the home front, prisoners and farmers shared food, laughter, and sometimes even tears. The climax of this story is not about armies or generals. It is about a bowl of stew, a Christmas gift, a handshake through barbed wire. It is about enemies realizing, in the most unlikely places, that kindness could exist even in war. And for the Japanese POWs, the moment they wept at such kindness was the moment the war's meaning began to change. The story of Japanese prisoners of war on American soil is one of the great paradoxes of the Second World War. It sits uneasily alongside tales of brutality, death marches, and mass destruction. And yet, it is precisely that contrast that makes it unforgettable. The war in the Pacific was merciless. On islands like Saipan and Iwo Jima, Japanese and American soldiers fought with no quarter given. Civilians were caught in the fire. In Japanese POW camps, captured Americans often endured starvation, beatings, and forced labor. The hatred seemed absolute, the gulf between the two nations unbridgeable. And yet, thousands of miles away, in the wheat fields of Nebraska, the cotton farms of Texas, and the orchards of California, the story was different. There, Japanese prisoners harvested crops, worked side by side with American families, and experienced something that shocked them more than battle ever could: dignity. To Japanese prisoners, this was disorienting. In their own army, conditions had been far harsher. Japanese soldiers often lived on meager rations of rice and barley. Medical treatment was primitive. Discipline was brutal. Officers frequently struck enlisted men for minor mistakes. To be fed and clothed by their enemy was bewildering. Soon, they were sent out to meet another surprise: the American farmer. With so many young men overseas, agriculture in the United States faced a crisis. Wheat needed harvesting, cotton needed picking, fruit needed canning. German and Italian POWs had already been used as labor, and now Japanese captives were added to the workforce. Trains pulled into small towns in Texas or the Midwest, unloading groups of prisoners who would work under guard in the fields. The first encounters were tense. Farmers watched the Japanese POWs with suspicion. Many had sons or brothers fighting in the Pacific. Some had lost loved ones at Pearl Harbor. For them, the men standing before them were not just strangers. They were enemies who wore the face of grief. And yet, as the days passed, something unusual began to unfold. Farmers quickly realized that these prisoners were, above all else, human beings. They worked hard, often silently, bending to pick cotton or harvesting corn in neat rows. They sweated in the summer sun. They shared jokes among themselves in a language the farmers couldn't understand. And when water was offered, they drank with gratitude. One Texas farmer later recalled, "At first, I couldn't stand the sight of them. But after a while, you saw they were just boys, like ours. They worked the land. They ate the food. They weren't devils." The POWs, for their part, were astonished by the treatment they received. Instead of whips or rifles at their backs, they were handed tools. Instead of being spat on, they were given bread and sometimes even pie after a long day's labor. The kindness of ordinary Americans contradicted everything they had been told about their enemy. Not every interaction was warm. There were farmers who refused to speak to the prisoners, who treated them with cold detachment. Guards sometimes shouted or intimidated them. And in the towns nearby, many civilians bristled at the idea of feeding prisoners while their own ration books limited meat and sugar. But the POWs also recorded moments that left them speechless. In Arkansas, a group of prisoners was stunned when local children waved at them as they rode by on trucks. In Texas, a farmer's wife once brought out extra cornbread and shared it with the Japanese prisoners, even though her own pantry was thin. One diary entry from a Japanese soldier captured at Guadalcanal reads, "I thought the Americans would kill me. Instead, I eat more than I ever did in the army. The farmers' children smile at me. They should hate me, but they do not. I cannot understand it." For American families, the decision to show kindness was not always easy. Some wrestled with guilt. How could they feed the enemy while their own sons were suffering in jungles thousands of miles away? Others justified it as pragmatism. The prisoners were laborers, and laborers needed food to work. But slowly, humanity broke through the barriers. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields. At first, the locals watched them closely, expecting sabotage or laziness. Instead, they labored with quiet diligence. Before long, townspeople were commenting that the POWs worked harder than some hired hands. In Texas, orchard owners recalled Japanese prisoners carefully handling fruit, as if they had been farmhands all their lives. The cultural clash was undeniable. These men had once shouted "Banzai" on Pacific battlefields, fighting to kill Americans at any cost. Now, they were stooping in the dirt, harvesting crops that would feed the very country they had attacked. The irony was not lost on anyone. And yet, what could have been a bitter standoff began to transform into something more complicated. As weeks turned into months, some farmers began to talk to the prisoners, using broken English or hand gestures. They exchanged words for water, bread, work. Children, fearless in their innocence, sometimes approached the prisoners at the fences, giggling and offering small gifts. For the POWs, Each of these moments chipped away at the image of Americans as monsters. For the farmers, each moment softened the image of the enemy as a faceless killer. By the end of 1943, Japanese POW labor was a common sight in many parts of rural America. Farmers depended on them. Families adjusted to their presence. And the prisoners themselves, once trembling with fear of execution, began to see the United States not as the cruel land of propaganda, but as a place where enemies treated enemies with unexpected fairness. Still, beneath this uneasy coexistence, questions lingered. Would kindness survive as the war's brutality intensified? Would Americans continue to show humanity when news of atrocities in the Pacific reached home? And what would happen when the prisoners realized that their captors' compassion might be more powerful than their empire's honor code? Those answers would come in the next stage of the story, when initial shock gave way to deeper, more personal connections between Japanese POWs and American families. For the Japanese prisoners, every day in America felt like a contradiction. They had been taught that capture was worse than death, that Americans were barbarians who would treat them with cruelty. Yet the reality of life on American farms was startlingly different. The cultural clash was immediate. Japanese POWs came from a society steeped in discipline, hierarchy, and ritual. Even in captivity, they saluted officers, bowed to superiors, and observed routines drilled into them since enlistment. On the farms of Texas, Nebraska, or Arkansas, they found themselves side by side with American civilians, men in overalls, women in aprons, and children running barefoot through the dust. At first, interaction was minimal. Guards often instructed farmers not to speak with the prisoners beyond basic commands. But silence gave way to necessity. Farmers needed to explain how to plant rows, harvest crops, or handle machinery. Gestures, broken English, and even drawings in the dirt bridged the gap. Slowly, words began to pass between captor and captive. For the POWs, the greatest surprise was fairness. They were paid small wages, token amounts under Geneva Convention rules, but enough to buy toiletries, cigarettes, or paper at the camp canteen. They were given scheduled rest breaks, proper meals, and medical care when sick or injured. To men who had once believed they would be beaten or starved, these small mercies felt enormous. And sometimes, they experienced something more powerful than fairness: kindness. In Arkansas, one farmer's wife made extra biscuits for the POWs after seeing how hungrily they ate their rations. In Nebraska, children would wave at prisoners working in the beet fields, their laughter echoing across the rows. At Christmas, some families sent small packages to the camp: cookies, socks, or handwritten notes, astonishing the men who had once braced for cruelty. A diary entry from a Japanese soldier captured in the Philippines reveals this shock. "The American woman gave me food with her own hands. She smiled. I felt shame, because her son may be fighting against mine." The POWs could not ignore the contrast between their captors' behavior and the horrors reported from the Pacific. They knew how Japanese forces treated Allied prisoners. Stories of the Bataan Death March and brutal labor camps had filtered even into their own ranks. Many expected retaliation in kind. Instead, they found themselves in a world where even enemies respected rules. This contrast gnawed at them. Some felt gratitude. Others felt confusion. A few, consumed by shame, withdrew deeper into silence. But nearly all admitted, whether openly or in private diaries, that the Americans had surprised them. Meanwhile, for the farmers, the presence of Japanese POWs was equally complicated. Many had family members fighting overseas. Some had lost sons at Pearl Harbor or Guadalcanal. Their grief was raw, their anger real. At first, they struggled to separate the young men in their fields from the enemy in their minds. Yet living alongside the POWs softened perspectives. They saw the prisoners laugh among themselves, tease one another, or quietly admire the vastness of the American landscape. They saw that the Japanese, too, missed home, longed for news of family, and endured the sting of separation. One farmer in Oklahoma later said, "At first, I thought I'd hate them. But after a season, I realized they were just boys. They worked, they sweated, they got tired, same as mine." Cultural exchanges emerged in unexpected places. Some POWs, skilled at carpentry, repaired fences or built furniture for farm families. Others, with artistic talent, sketched portraits of children, or painted scenes on scraps of wood. Farmers' wives displayed these gifts for years, reminders of the strange time when their enemies lived among them. Music, too, bridged the divide. In several camps, Japanese prisoners formed choirs or played instruments. On Sundays, American churchgoers walking past the wire could hear foreign hymns rising into the air, familiar melodies sung in unfamiliar language. More than one American remarked how haunting it was to hear the same tune, Silent Night, Amazing Grace, from the throats of men who had once carried rifles against their sons. The bonds that formed were not universal. Many Americans refused to soften, keeping their distance or treating the POWs as mere tools. Some children were forbidden to go near the camps. And there were incidents of hostility, stones thrown, insults shouted, fists clenched in anger. But these episodes only made the moments of humanity more striking. In Texas, a farmer reportedly asked the guards if he could bring watermelons to share with the Japanese workers. In Nebraska, a group of POWs was stunned when a farmer's daughter shyly handed them wildflowers through the fence. In Arkansas, a guard allowed prisoners to rest in the shade while he himself worked alongside them. Such gestures confused the POWs. In their culture, enemies were not supposed to show compassion. They wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Was this kindness genuine? Was it a trick? Or had everything they had been taught about Americans been wrong? For many, the realization was painful. They had been taught to hate, to believe in Japanese superiority, to expect cruelty. But here, in the fields of America, they were forced to acknowledge something else, that the enemy could also be human. As months turned into years, some POWs even formed friendships with American families. These relationships remained tentative, barbed wire and guards ensured boundaries, but they existed. Letters were exchanged. Small tokens were given. And when the war ended, some prisoners carried home memories not of brutality, but of generosity. These experiences planted seeds that would grow long after the war. Seeds of doubt in Japanese wartime propaganda. Seeds of respect for American society. And seeds of reconciliation between two nations that, at that very moment, were locked in a struggle to the death across the Pacific. But for now, in the middle of the war, the contradictions only deepened. How could farmers show kindness to men whose countrymen had killed so many Americans? How could Japanese prisoners reconcile the warmth of American kitchens with the firestorms raging in the Pacific? It was a paradox at the heart of their captivity, one that would shape not only their own lives, but the future relationship between Japan and the United States.